Hello, my name is Wendy Joseph, and I will be speaking about Frederick Douglass and his involvement with the women's rights movement. What do we know about Frederick Douglass and his connection to women's rights? The Library of Congress notes, for Frederick Douglass, second only to that of Black liberation was women's rights, a field for his endeavors from the mid-1850s to the day of his death.
Observing woman's agency, devotion, and efficiency in pleading the cause of the slave, gratitude for this high service early moved me to give favorable attention to the subject of what is called woman's rights, and caused me to be denominated a woman's rights man. I am glad to say that I have never been ashamed to be thus designated.
Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, organized the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in the United States. We must remember that the Seneca Falls Convention was advertised as a women's rights convention. We are talking about just moving the needle on women's social, civil, and societal rights, where women's lives were directed by men and could not inherit property, sign contracts, serve on a jury, or vote. On July 20th, 1848, Frederick Douglass and about 40 other men joined the assembled crowd of 200 women at the Seneca Falls Convention to pass 11 resolutions, one of them in support of women's right to vote.
Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will.
In addition to speaking out against slavery, Douglass was a strong proponent of gender equality. Not satisfied to merely support the cause from afar, he actively participated in promoting women's right to vote, forming personal relationships with key movement leaders, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In his social and political activism, Douglass announced his commitment to the cause, including "Right is of no sex" in the motto of his weekly newspaper, The North Star.
When a great truth once gets abroad in the world, no power on earth can imprison it, or prescribe its limits, or suppress it. It is bound to go on till it becomes the thought of the world. Such a truth is woman's right to equal liberty with man.
The resolution on the subject of votes for women caused dissension until Frederick Douglass took the platform with a passionate speech in favor of having a suffrage statement within the proposed Declaration of Sentiments. Douglass strongly supported suffrage for women, but believed that white women already enjoyed some amount of electoral privilege through the family, something which all Black people, men and women, were totally cut off from. Stanton, among others, believed that support had earned a united front toward suffrage. The dispute cleaved the women's suffrage movement for nearly 3 decades. Nevertheless, Frederick Douglass, the only African American at the Seneca Valley Convention, remembered Stanton as a crucial influence in moving him from a narrow abolitionism toward a broader humanism. In his 1884 third autobiography entitled Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, he wrote,
In a conversation with Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton when she was yet a young lady and an earnest abolitionist, she was at pains of setting before me in a very strong light the wrong and injustice of this exclusion. I could not meet her arguments except with the shallow plea of custom, natural division of duties, indelicacy of woman's taking part in politics, the common talk of women's sphere, and the like. All of which that able woman, who was then no less logical than now, brushed away by those arguments which she has so often and effectively used since, and which no man has yet successfully refuted.
40 years after Seneca Falls, at the 1888 International Council of Women Convention in Washington, D.C., Elizabeth Cady Stanton fondly recalls a seminal moment at that first Women's Rights Convention. I wanted to demand the right of suffrage then and there, so I drew up a very short resolution, and my husband said to me, "Now you make the whole thing ridiculous. So long as you advocated simply rights of education, rights of property, rights of children, and all that sort of thing, it was very well. But the idea of demanding the right of suffrage..." Unfortunately, I had never said a word in public, and how to put two sentences together I did not know. So I surveyed the convention, and there I saw Frederick Douglass, and I knew that Frederick, from personal experience, was just the man for the work. So I presented my resolution, then hurried to his side and whispered in his ear what I wanted said, and he went along a while very well. But he didn't speak quite fast enough for me, nor say all I wanted said, and the first thing I knew, I was on my feet defending the resolution. And in due time, Douglas and I carried the whole convention, and the resolution was passed unanimously. Perhaps more than anything previously mentioned, Douglas's 1888 speech on women's suffrage best demonstrated his deep commitment to advancing women's rights. In his speech, Douglas established himself as a humble and longtime ally of the women's suffrage movement, highlighting its progress over time. Recalling the beginning stages, Douglas spoke of how he had joined the early network of supporters. Though he acknowledged that the women leading the cause demonstrated a great dose of fortitude, looking back, Douglas also recalled that they had few allies. To that end, he offered his assistance and input as needed. From 1848 until 1888, Douglas understood the significance of employing his privilege as a man, noting in his speech that there was a time perhaps when we men could help a little.
There are few facts in my humble history to which I look back with more satisfaction than to the fact recorded in the history of the woman suffrage movement that I was sufficiently enlightened at that early day, and when only a few years from slavery, to support your resolution for woman suffrage. I have done very little in this world in which to glory except this one act, and I certainly glory in that. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of woman, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act.
At the same time, Douglas emphasized that he and all male allies only played a supportive role in the movement. It was not their space to speak on behalf of women, perfectly capable of representing themselves. He made it a point to state that men who entered the space as supporters mainly had one role, listening so that women could talk. Douglas said,
"And I believe no man, however gifted with thought and speech, can voice the wrongs and present the demands of women with the skill and effect, with the power and authority of woman herself."
To this end, he continuously centered women, the oppositions they faced, the ironclad arguments they crafted, the success they enjoyed, and the progress they made in his speech from start to end. He stressed that women had ignited a movement rooted in truth, a movement that would not die. 40 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Douglass reaffirmed his support as an ally and his hope for the final triumph of women's cause, not only in this country, but throughout the world.
One thing is certain. This new revolution in human thought will never go backward. When a great truth once gets abroad in the world, no power on earth can imprison it, or prescribe its limits, or suppress it. It is bound to go on till it becomes the thought of the world. Such a truth is woman's right to equal liberty with man. She was born with it. It was hers before she comprehended it. It is inscribed upon all the powers and faculties of her soul, and no custom, law, or usage can ever destroy it.
He was introduced by Mrs. Lucy Stone. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the generation that has come on the stage since the war can hardly now realize, in view of the fundamental principles of American government, that slavery ever existed here, that the pulpit and the press, that the church and the state ever defended it. So, when this battle for women's suffrage shall have been fought and the victory won, men will marvel at the injustices and stupidity which so long deprived American women of the ballot. It is hardly necessary for me to say, after what I have already said, that I am a radical women's suffrage man. I was such a man nearly 50 years ago. I had hardly brushed the dust of slavery from my feet and stepped upon the free soil of Massachusetts when I took the suffrage side of this question. Time, thought, and experience have only increased the strength of my conviction. I believe equally in its justice, in its wisdom, and in its necessity. On the afternoon of the 20th of February in 1895, Frederick Douglass, a massive, leonine figure, his burly 6 feet capped by an unruly mass of white hair, strode into a meeting of the National Council of Women at Metzeret Hall in Washington, D.C. He carried his honors, the honors of more than 60 years' fight for liberty, like a monarch, and like a monarch he was received. Susan B. Anthony, his old friend and sometimes enemy from Rochester, and the Reverend Anna H. Shaw escorted him to the platform, where a Mary Wright Sewall, presiding, invited him to speak. He declined, acknowledging the standing ovation only with a bow, but took his seat and remained throughout the proceedings. It was his last public appearance. He died that evening of a heart attack at his home, Cedar Hill, in Anacostia. As Mrs. Sewall pointed out, in adjourning the evening session upon receipt of the news of his death, it was an historic coincidence that Douglass should have spent his last day in encouraging the course of women's suffrage. It had been one of his deepest concerns for nearly half a century. Miss Susan B. Anthony then arose to read a letter from Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, highly eulogistic of the deceased. Miss Anthony prefaced the reading of the letter with some remarks of her own. Miss Anthony said Mrs. Stanton was beloved by Frederick Douglass more than any other woman in the ranks of the suffragists. The letter of Mrs. Stanton recalled incidents in her associations with Mr. Douglass and told of her grief at his death. Taking up the Morning Tribune, the first words that caught my eye thrilled my very soul. Frederick Douglass is dead. What vivid memories, thick and fast, flashed through my mind and held me spellbound in contemplation of the long years since first we met. Trained in the severe school of slavery, I saw him first before a Boston audience, fresh from the land of bondage. He stood there like an African prince, conscious of his dignity and power, grand in his physical proportions, majestic in his wrath, as with keen wit, satire, and indignation he portrayed the bitterness of slavery, the humiliation of subjection to those who in all human virtues and capacities were inferior to himself. His denunciation of our national crime, of the wild and guilty fantasy that men could hold property in man, poured like a torrent that fairly made his hearers tremble. Thus I first saw him, and wondered as I listened that any mortal man should have ever tried to subjugate a being with such marvelous powers, such self-respect, and such intense love of liberty. Around him sat the great anti-slavery orators of the day, watching his effect on that immense audience, completely magnetized with his eloquence, laughing and crying by turns with his rapid flights from pathos to humor. All other speakers seemed tame after Douglass. Sitting near, I heard Philip say to Lydia Marie Child, "Verily, this boy, who has just only graduated from the Southern institution, as slavery was called, throws us all in the shade." "Ah," she replied, "the iron has entered his soul, and he knows the wrongs of slavery subjectively. The rest of you speak only from an objective point of view." He used to preach a sermon in imitation of the Methodist clergy from the text, "Servants, obey your masters," which the people were never tired of hearing. Often, after he had spoken about an hour, shouts would go up from all parts of the house, "Now, Douglass, give us the sermon!" Some of our literary critics pronounce this the best piece of satire in the English language. As an orator, writer, and editor, Douglass holds an honored place among the gifted men of his day. As a man of business and a public officer, he has been preeminently successful, honest, and upright in all his dealings. He bears an enviable reputation. As a husband, father, neighbor, and friend, in all social relations, he has been faithful and steadfast to the end. He was the only man I ever knew who understood the degradation of disenfranchisement for women. Through all the long years of our struggle, he's been a familiar figure on our platform, with always an inspiring word to say. In the very first convention, he helped me to carry the resolution I penned, demanding women's suffrage. Frederick Douglass is not dead. His grand character will long be an object lesson in our national history. His lofty sentiments of liberty, justice, and equality, echoed on every platform over our broad land, must influence and inspire many coming generations. Sincerely, Elizabeth Cady Stanton.